His name is Kurt Folke with Quest CPAs. Kurt has put together a presentation surrounding some of the key issues that we think are important for school leaders to know relating to some of the procurement policies and procedures, and especially as they relate to public charter schools. So Kurt is going to take over the screen and put up his presentation, but what we hope you'll get out of this section is a good idea of exactly how to ensure that you comply with all the procurement policies and procedures that are required for federal grants. And so I don't steal any of Kurt's thunder and say anything he wants to cover himself. I'm going to go ahead and let him jump on and say hello.
All right. Well, good evening and thank you, Mark. Just as Mark said, my name is Kurt Folke, and I will be pulling up the presentation that should have been attached to the invitation link that came earlier, and as soon as you probably registered for this presentation. Should look like something like this. So basically what we'll be going over for the rest of the evening here will be procurement policies, and we'll be discussing various aspects of those. As Mark mentioned, there is 2 spots in which you can ask questions because you as attendees, I believe, are muted. So you won't be able to orally ask questions right there, but please do go down to the bottom of the screen and enter any questions you might have in either the chat or the Q&A spot, and the other panelists will do their best to answer those. And I will go ahead and try to stop every 2 or 3 slides and go ahead and review those and make sure that we're answering those so that everybody is making sure that we get a good handle on those items, because it's very likely that if one of us has got a question on something, we probably all do. So, okay, well, let's get started. The contents of the presentation tonight are going to be a review of school, Idaho, federal, and CSP grant procurement policies. So we're going to kind of see those from all different angles. We're going to review time and effort reporting requirements. We're going to look at the best practices of policy development, approval, and monitoring. We're going to look at the monitoring of internal controls for policies. We're going to look at some documentation best practices for policies, and then kind of wrap up with a Q&A session if we haven't already answered any questions along the way that you might have. All right, so jumping into the first section here, as you look at and you start developing your various procurement policies, you kind of have to start with what you already have. And so you kind of need to step back and review the school's current procurement policies. And what most schools find is that they go ahead and, you know, when they start their charter school, they adopt some very, you know, simple procurement policies, which typically work really well when they start. But as they evolve, they tend to either add to, or they maybe have some, you know, verbal procurement policies. And just as a reminder, the word procurement is just a fancy word that means how we obtain or we buy something. But anyway, so they kind of add to, and sometimes they just have these explanations that is kind of from the board to management and the management to key staff as to how they do certain things, but they don't always put it in writing. And what we typically see is the written procurement policies are the ones that were adopted when the school was first formed. And so it's worthwhile going back and seeing what you actually have written and kind of make sure that they're updated and they meet the school's expectation and standards. It kind of goes back to the old concept that, you know, we can only make sure that people are fulfilling and following what we have in written form. We always have lots of expectations, but if they're not in written form, we really can't hold people accountable to that. And we'll go into a little more detail on that in a little bit. Am I coming through loud and clear to everyone?
coming clear to me, Kurt. I hope that means
Great.
everybody else. Yes,
No,
we're getting some
the
loud and
panelists
clear.
anyway. Great,
Yes,
okay.
the comments are coming in the chat. Loud and
Loud and clear. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so once you've kind of already reviewed the school's current policies, the next tier down is what's broader than the school. Well, what's broader than the school and what we have to follow is the Idaho procurement policies. The Idaho's procurement policies, we kind of have two options right there, and they're not really options so much as what do we fall into. Charter schools are by default nonprofit corporations, and so they are nonprofit organizations. However, there's a lot of sections in Idaho code that by default say that charter schools have to follow this section of Idaho code and that section of Idaho code. And a lot of them refer them on and say they have to follow a lot of the same types of sections of Idaho code that traditional public charter or public school districts follow. And so there's a lot of overlap in terms of what charter schools have to follow and public school districts have to follow. And therefore, ultimately, it is best for charter schools to consult their attorney and say, when it applies to the Idaho, procurement rules, do we follow nonprofit procurement rules or government procurement rules? Again, get your school's, opinion on that, or your attorney's opinion on that, because there's some schools that do it one way and there's some schools that do it the other. And we see it's basically, I don't want to say half and half, but we see schools do it both different directions. So it is worthwhile definitely making sure you're familiar with, are you following nonprofit procurement rules or government procurement rules? And what you're going to see on this slide is the rules that are for Idaho government procurement rules, not because we're saying you need to follow these unless your attorney recommends so, but because most of the reviews that you're going to have from the State Department are coming from folks that are versed in and trained in the Idaho government procurement rules. The reasoning for that is the charter schools, even though they've been around since the early 2000s and so forth in Idaho, most of the folks at the state are trained in what is easiest for them to accomplish for the school districts and the charter schools. And so they don't really want to have to teach their staff both nonprofit and, and what works for governmental. So you see that a lot of those folks are very well trained in the Idaho government procurement rules. They may or may not be trained in the nonprofit rules. So it's at least very good to know the Idaho government procurement rules, regardless of whether you're following them or not, based on what your attorney says. So with that in mind, here is the rules for when you procure under the Idaho government rules. If you're buying something up to $10,000 per purchase, you follow the what they call micro purchase rule. It says no quotes or bids are needed. So obviously just keep the receipt, but you don't have to check for various, figure out what this vendor is charging and what that vendor is charging. You just simply use your best judgment. If you have a purchase that's between $10,000 and up to $50,000, that is the small purchase procurement rule. And you do have to obtain 2 to 3 verbal quotes. And you do need to document the responses. So what does that mean? If they're verbal quotes, but you have to document, that just means you need to write down somewhere, and you can do that, obviously you can handwrite it or you can put it in the computer somewhere. You need to write down, hey, I talked to John on this date and he said it will cost $12,000. I talked to Mike at this business and he said it would be $14,000, and have one more of those or whatever you can do there, and put that behind the receipt to prove why you picked the one you did. And then if you have a purchase between the $50,000 and up to $100,000, that's semi-formal bidding. And with that, you have to have 3 written bids. So these are written, these aren't just verbal. And they have to follow what are called the procedures that are at Idaho Code 672806, Section 1. If you're using this, I recommend that you do go to the Idaho Code section and familiarize yourself with those, because there is some specific rules you need to follow. And that is also the case with anything over $100,000. there's some additional rules there as they require not just written bids, but publication requirements. And so we've included the Idaho code sections right there so you can find those pretty easily. So I am going to double check and see how we are catching up on any questions coming in. Looks like good. We're getting a few questions on the, looks like everybody's good. Not too many questions. All right, so we'll continue through. So now we're on to the federal procurement policies. And again, so we started with the
Kurt,
school.
you've unshared your screen.
Thank you.
So you need to reshare. There it goes.
Okay, we're back on and we're looking now at the federal procurement policies. And again, just kind of stepping back in time, we start by looking at what the school is currently following from their procurement policies, then on to what the state requires, and now we're at the federal level procurement policies. Federal procurement policies, they have a general standard that says all procurements must follow best practices. That seems kind of self-evident, but they have a lot of best practices they follow, but it basically means you can't be wasteful and that you must use common sense and you know, don't do things that aren't prudent and you know, use due diligence and things like that. Again, they're common sense, but they basically mean, you know, don't go out and pay, you know, twice the price for something if it doesn't make sense. And so that's what that best practice standards means. They prohibit time and materials contracts. In other words, they're not allowed. So you can't go out and buy something from a contractor when the contractor just says, hey, it'll be time and materials. We don't have a total dollar amount, it'll just be time and materials. So that is not allowed. Now you will see some contractor contracts that say, you know, we will bill by time and materials, but at a maximum dollar amount of say $150,000. When we hit the maximum 150, we stop. So that is allowable, but not where there is no maximum cap. Items of procurement must be reviewed by someone other than the person initiating the purchase. This is key. We see this very often, in fact, and because this is something that you may or may not have in your school as a procurement policy, but it is something that's required for federal procurements. It says items of procurement must be reviewed by someone other than the person initiating the purchase. So what's the most common and easiest way to accomplish this is, say we're a small charter school, or in some cases even a big charter school, and the business manager is the one initiating the purchase, then the logical person to review that would be like the administrator. So he or she would go ahead and sign you know, the initiation saying, hey, yes, I've approved the purchase. That's all it takes. And if they don't do that, then there's no evidence that they reviewed it and that somebody looked at it prior to the business manager initiating the purchase. So that's a requirement. And then there's the basic federal procurement rules. They're somewhat similar to Idaho's, but they're a little bit different. And so just a quick review, they have the same up to 10,000, the micro purchase, no quotes or bids are needed. Then they broaden the 10,000 and they go all the way up to the 250,000. They call that the small purchase. At least 3 bids are needed, written bids, and 2 must be from new sources. So if you're going out and doing something somewhat routine, you know, every year, every couple of years, you do need to try to get them from new sources if this is a federal project. So you can't always be bidding with the exact same sources unless there's no other sources available. And you need to keep records of procurement. Now, that just means documentation. You need to have documentation for why you did what you did. So these were the ones we, these were the bids that we got, and this is the why I selected the one I did. Or, this is the second time we did the bidding. We tried to get 2 new ones, but there was no one that would apply. And so we were only able to get one new one. If you have that record of procurement and it's reviewed, then the auditor will know why you did what you did. The last level right here is the $250,000 and above sealed bid. And that one is the highest level. Sealed bids, publication requirements. In general, lowest bids must be accepted. There's a very few exceptions, but again, most of the time we're going to use the lowest bid unless we clearly know that, say, a contractor or someone like that is going to do substandard work or something like that.
Kurt, I'm going to pipe in here a little bit. So for our grant recipients, the CSP grant recipients, you are mostly going to fall into the micro purchase and small purchase category. Of course, I don't think there's anybody buying anything over 250K. On the small purchase side, we get a lot of questions regarding that when a purchase ends up being over $10,000. One of the best ways for an administrator, especially if they're, I have some administrators that are doing some of the procurement. One of the best ways administrators are documenting this is just by writing a short memo and including that memo with the evidence of the acquisition. It tends to not be a lot of transactions that fall under this amount, but the ones that do, there's definitely that federal procurement documentation requirement, and we recommend that schools have some sort of way of easily denoting that they've gone through the process of getting 3 bids and do something to put it in writing. We found that sometimes it's good to have well, Kurt will talk more about some of the details, but as a reminder, it's good to have something in your files, and we'd love to have that submitted if you have a purchase that's over 10,000. Thank you.
No, that's a great time to bring it up, Mark, and please add in the practical examples like this, because we'll talk about the documentation of this in a little bit, but I think the question comes up, when you start, because a purchase, especially the larger purchases, they don't just instantaneously happen, especially those with bids. They can take months and months and months, and then the board deliberates, and it can just go on and on and on. So the documentation file, it starts, but it doesn't get finished, until the very end of the project, or even until the purchase gets finalized. So it's kind of like, well, what does that file look like? What does the documentation look like? So in general, what we recommend to schools is have a file, whether that's, a digital file, or if you're, using paper, have a literal file that you're keeping the information in. So if it's, at the end of the year and it's getting audited, they can at least see, hey, you're keeping this, this bid that's come in so far, and you're waiting for more bids. You haven't fully decided on the purchase or whatever it is. But when the job is finally done, at that point in time, you can assemble, here's the bids, this is the reason we selected it, the one we did, and you can kind of have a complete package. Now that sounds like a lot of detail, but if you kind of get organized from the start, it's not too bad. What you typically see on the most organized ones is they have a cover sheet. And the cover sheet says, we need the invoice, we need the bids, we need a page that simply shows why did we just, select the one we did, and any other notes. And it's really as simple as that. When I say it's simple as that, it's as simple as that when it's complete. I realize the process of going through it is not simple. There's a lot of details, there's a lot of hand scratched notes. It's hard to get the bids back from people, all those kinds of things. But in terms of the final package, when they're done, 3 months from when they started it, or depending on the size of the project or whatever, that's what they want to accumulate. So if they can kind of start with the end in mind, it can sometimes make that process easier. All right. So moving on here to the a review of the, again, we're still in the review of the procurement policies, and now we've gone from, again, from the school level procurement policies to the Idaho procurement level policies to the federal level procurement policies, and finally at the most detailed is the CSP grant procurement policies. And this is really, you know, the meat of the presentation, in the sense that this is, you know, this is the program that we're talking about today. But we really had to cover all those other ones because, you know, this has to fit into them. And so again, as a reminder, the CSP is the Charter School Grant Program, and it's a federal program, and therefore it has to follow all the federal procurement policies that we described previously. Has to follow all those rules. The CSP procurements should follow the grant's budgeted expenses that are approved by Bloom as the you know, as the grant agency, and they must be an allowable cost. In other words, they cannot be an unallowable cost. And I would review the allowable cost guide for in-depth information on what's an allowable versus an unallowable cost and practical examples. I'm gonna go over and look at that real briefly. I believe it was sent out in link form with the, when folks registered for this. You folks did a really, really good job. I'm gonna see if I've got it pulled up here in front of me. Here it is. Did an excellent job of putting it together. And in this day and age, I know, you know, business managers have a ton of information, tons of emails, thousands of emails coming from the state on all these deadlines and all this new instruction and all this information. And they have to kind of filter out a lot of it so they can actually get to the essential of what they got to do on a day-to-day basis. But for those schools that have this grant, this is just a really good tool. It's worth definitely going through because it will make their life a lot easier. It was a really, you know, well put together type of manual. It gives them practical examples. It's written in very easy to understand words. We use it as auditors, not just because we're auditors, but because we like a simple manual that we can understand with good practical examples. So maybe many of you as attendees are familiar with it, but if you're not, definitely make sure you get this and that you familiarize yourself with it, or at least have it as an example if you run into questions. Because it's good.
So Kurt, from a CSP grantee perspective, most of them will have gone through this in detail when submitting their budgets, and luckily we through the grant application process, we provide them with this information, the cost guide and the examples, and we even had questions come up back and forth in regards to what is allowable, what's not allowable. And certainly we want you to continue to refer to this guide. Hopefully if you have a approved budget through us for your CSP grant and you have line items that have met the requirements to be in those GL codes that we provided, we're pretty confident that those will be allowable costs. And the key is to continue to recognize that it has to be reasonable, it has to be for the project, it has to support the goals of your grant. But overall, I was happy to see that of all the applications that we received, it looks like everyone paid attention to this cost guide. So thank you for doing that. And if questions do come up as you're expending funds and you're uncertain as to whether something really fits a line item or a category, again, please reach out to us and we'll help you ensure that those costs are put in the right category, and we understand together what the allowability of a certain cost is. So that's that. One of the questions that came up along the way is if we have an example of some of those short memos schools have used. I have some, and I'll share those out in a few minutes.
Okay, great. All right. see, back to our presentation here. Okay. Now on to time and effort reporting requirements. Many of you are probably familiar with it, or at least have heard of time and effort reporting. It is something that came about as part of the Uniform Grant Guidance, which came about 5 years ago. And so federal government said, we need proof anytime you're charging salaries and wages and benefits to a federal program. We need proof that your staff actually worked in this federal program. So basically they required that, and so any salaries, wages, benefits, personnel time that is charged to a federal program must be supported by what they call time and effort documentation. It's just that, proof that staff actually spent time in that federal program. So common documentation forms include what they call like a PAR or a personal activity report, extra documentation that might be added on a timesheet, or for staff that work entirely within a federal program, like entirely within Title I or entirely within, special ed or something, they can use what's called a semi-annual certification. Some of you are going to know exactly what I'm talking about, and for some of you that may not use this a whole lot, I would encourage you to kind of get familiar with it, because you will get hit on your next review from the state on that. They really look hard at this stuff. And so again, all we're talking about is some form of documentation that says, okay, this person works half of their time, in Title I, and therefore 4 hours of their day is spent and charged to Title I. So again, it's just something that gets added on their timesheet, or they have a separate sheet that's typically called a personal activity report. Again, or if you have full-timers that work entirely within departments, they typically use that semi-annual certification. And then just as a reminder, compensation must be evidenced by board-ratified employment contracts or letters listing the staff name, position, hire date, and agreed pay rate and salary. Again, I know that's kind of a no-brainer. What I would say is, there is a fair bit of turnover throughout the state in the school world. I think there's turnover in all businesses, but when you see turnover, a lot of times contracts don't always get signed like they should. And so make sure things get, for all staff, that they're board ratified employment contracts and letters that are listing exactly what people should be getting paid, and that those match up. This isn't just for federal, but make real sure the federal side is covered. Because otherwise it's no questions asked, not approved. All right, so now we're moving on to policy development, approval, and monitoring. Okay, so a couple things in terms of the definition of policies. It's important to kind of talk about what they are, what policies are, and what they aren't. Specifically in terms of what they are, policies, they establish direction, they ensure there's legal compliance, they protect the resources, they define expectations both to like our staff, our students, they establish, the standards, the board standards, what they're expecting of, again, our staff, our school, our students. But in terms of what they're not laws, they're not statutes, they're not forms, they're not procedures. So there's the guidelines, if you will, and in terms of how broad or how narrow are they, there needs to be some flexibility in them. So they should not be too restrictive or detailed or complex. Flexibility is very, very important. And they do need to integrate with our other governing documents. Very, very critical that they do. You can't have policies that have nothing, do not integrate, that don't make sense with our other governing documents. So very, very important that they do when you're, building them and adopting and approving them. In terms of the development of your policies, it is typical for schools to, find a reputable policy source and start adopting them from there. Some schools use like the ISBA as their source, or they might have another source. It's kind of hard to just start, a school and start writing your own policies and having no place to start. So that's why you typically see a school that starts with maybe ISBA or maybe another school or something like that. What's confusing sometimes is they're huge, they're massive, they take a lot of time, and so they're a bit overwhelming, but that's typically where they come from, and you want to make sure you're getting it from someone who knows what they're talking about and that is covering what needs to be in there. There's federally mandated policies, things like homeless children rules, special ed, grant procurement, things like that, things that also come from the state. That need to be included there. Again, special ed world, bullying, that's a big deal lately and has been for the last few years. So the state mandates that we have certain policies relating to that. They're self-created oftentimes, as a school has a specific need. And so they kind of develop those internally, saying our school, we want it to function like this. It's important for our school to do this specifically, and it may be different than other schools, and that's what makes us unique as a charter, as we can. And so, they'll build that policy with that thought in mind. Review of policies. Couple things to think about that. Policies should be publicly available, and that's something that sometimes we're not always sure of, I think. As charter schools, we're not always clear, are these things, is this public information or not? And it is. So we need to keep that in mind when we're developing them and making them. We should designate a team to review them annually. That's another tough one is this stuff takes a lot of time. And for those of you that have, are going through policies right now or whatever, you're thinking, good gracious, the policy section of our board meetings is taking so much time. So when we have this suggestion here of designate a team to review annually, we're not talking about spending endless time going through all your policies constantly, but chunk it. If you've got to, say every 3 years we're going to try to go through all of them, then each year bite off a chunk. And it doesn't have to be every part of every policy, but it does need to be the fact you don't want to go 10 years and have never looked at your policies. It is important to go through, make sure they're up to date, make sure the expectations are what the current board thinks they should be and what management thinks they should be. They can be event triggered, things can happen, and all of a sudden, they got to be changed right now, which it always tends to be, I wish it would have been this, but now we've got this and now we can't enforce it because our policy doesn't say that. But that tends to be a lot of the reason why policies are what they are, is because something happens and we know we have to change it. And you can have, a regular board schedule to review. You can review them every 3 months or part of every meeting, whatever works best for your school. You see a lot of variation that way. Some schools have a specific, committee that does it after the board meetings or before the board meetings, or, once every 3 months or once every month. It can really drag out. But if you have a very organized board, it can work pretty good too. So, okay, monitoring of internal controls for policies. After policies are reviewed and updated, approved, and staff is trained, we want to ensure that our internal controls are in place and operating. So, it's not enough just to have a policy, to review it, update it, approve it, and train our staff. We got to make sure it's actually out there in our school and working. And so we've got to monitor it through ongoing controls, make sure it's in place, operating, and we got to monitor it. We can do that through, checking and saying, hey, are invoices really being reviewed by the administrator? Or was that just a good idea? And so we really want to check. Yep, looks like administrator's looking at it. Or are bank statements really being reviewed by someone other than the person that does the bank statement reconciliation? Yep, looks like somebody's reviewing it. We see their initials here, and it's not the person doing the bank reconciliation that's also reviewing it. So you look at your controls. Are they happening? That's the goal. You can also monitor through periodic internal audits. So you can set up, you don't have to do this. If you're doing these other two, then you're probably fine. But this is another way to do it. You can have, periodic internal audits that you're doing yourself. So your own staff is doing this. They kind of go in, every 3 months or every 6 months, and they kind of do their own internal audits. You see those more with larger charter schools that might have several schools in going on right there, and they kind of go out and do little internal audits, make sure that the schools are doing what they want them to do. And then possibly most important, you provide feedback. We don't want to just be giving feedback when things aren't working. We want to give feedback when they are working, so we can enhance, give some positive feedback and say, this is working really good, keep it up. And so we want to do that a lot. Documentation best practices. Documentation best practices, there has been a new standard change and in the documentation world. It hit the auditors before it hit you as auditees, you would say, but it's very important, and I think a lot of schools are doing a great job, but it's just important to know. And so we kind of emphasize here, always, always, always include and attach documentation related to procurement. So we kind of talked about all the different procurement rules that are at a school level, and Idaho or state level, federal level, CSP level, and it's very, very critical that along that path that we start writing notes for anything that we don't have yet. We keep everything in a file. It may not be a pretty file until it's all done, but once the procurement is finally made and we order or we approve the purchase, we put a nice documentation file together. And at that point in time, it's done. It's got any notes, it's got the actual invoice or whatever it is, and it's got any bids behind it, plus a little bit of documentation saying why we picked the one we did. And so that's the completed package for anything that requires bids. Obviously, things that don't require bids are a lot simpler. It's as simple as the invoice. That also includes, approval by somebody other than the person initiating the invoice. And as included here, the new standard for documentation is not documented, not done. And that's a big change in the documentation world. The reason is historically, we as auditors could go based on our understanding of our clients, in the sense that if our client said, we did get 3 bids, and we could, and maybe we didn't keep the documentation, but this one was way higher, they're always higher, and this is the best deal, and they're always the best deal, and that's why we went with this one. And if we knew the client knew what they were doing, we could maybe trust them a little bit. We can't do that anymore. We have to only go by what's in the documentation file. If the bids are not there, or if the documentation isn't there, we have to assume it was not documented, even if the client really knows what they're doing and and we really trust them. It's not about trust anymore. It's purely about, is the documentation there or not? And so that's something that's important to keep in mind. Unfortunately, it just requires more and more documentation, but it's something that we all need to understand, is that's the new standard. Again, is this last point here, keep notes on the procurement package and then update the final procurement package once the procurement is complete. So I've said that 2 or 3 times here, but that's what business managers tell us is their way of keeping track of things, because again, when they initiate procurement, especially when it comes to bids or quotes, it's not a pretty sight. There's lots of little notes. The board changes their mind. Sometimes the project doesn't go anywhere. They get little faxed bids or handwritten bids or whatever it is. And so they just throw things in a file, or they scan stuff in, throw it in a little file. But when it's complete and they initiate or approve the final item, that's when they put it all in a nice, pretty format. And I think, Mark, you said you have like a little form, or you see a lot of schools, you have a little form that maybe summarizes that information. Is that right?
So Crystal sent out an example of a really brief one that was put together by Steve Lambert on a procurement where he was able to solicit 3 bids and do a kind of a summary evaluation of those bids. I'm also going to recommend that it's kind of it's almost like a checklist that you need to have for any procurement over 10,000. And it was in the PowerPoint a couple slides ago. And it comes down to 3 bids from qualified sources, if possible, 2 of which should be new sources, if possible. The solicitation has to adequately describe the goods or services to be procured. That's often as simple as, you know, what item you're requiring. You can't impose unreasonable requirements. That's just kind of I don't know if you need to checklist that. Then the decision has to be documented, and that example that I got from Steve just shows how they made the decision. It's like a little grid almost, and it makes it pretty easy for anyone to understand how the decision was made. And lastly, there's all procurements, regardless of size. Efforts must be made to use small minority businesses and women's business enterprises when practicable, which is an interesting word. So if you do happen to identify a vendor that fits one of these categories, it'd always be good to maybe indicate that with a little checkbox. So I'm going to put together just a real quick checklist for you that just a little modified one that I've used that we can send out. But it's really just to have a quick memo. You put it with the procurement over $10,000, and then you always have something in your files that shows that you did your due diligence and are doing what you need to be in compliance. So I'll send that out in a little bit as well.
Excellent. That's helpful. It's really helpful to folks because it is a lot of information. You're thinking, man, we make these procurements fairly often. That's a ton of information to have to collect, document, and put together just for making a purchase. But I think if they have like a little, you know, template to follow and then they start using it, it's not too bad in the end. It's just having a template to follow. The one thing I would say too, the requirement, it's important to read the full depth of the requirements because some of them can be waived if there's no options, like it wants 3 bids, but if there's not 3 available, then you can move to 2. And again, so read the detail. What we're going over today is very broad. It's to make you aware of the requirements so that you can say, boy, I've never heard of that before. No, you have heard of it. It's important to dig into the detail a little bit more. The requirement to use women-owned or small business as defined by the Small Business Administration. When you read that, you think, okay, do I have to research every business to figure out who owns it and do they fit the criteria as a small business? Again, that's another one that can be waived if your options are very small. However, what's interesting in Idaho is that almost every single business that you're going to deal with, not always, but most of the time, is going to be defined as a small business under the Small Business Administration because it's been some years since I've looked at it, but I think it's like $100 million in revenue or something like that is a small business as defined by the Small Business Administration. And a lot of the contractors and the other businesses that most of the schools use don't have over 100 million, it might even be a whole lot more than that. I have to refresh my memory, but I remember reading that and quickly realizing that I shouldn't say all the contractors because there are some very big ones, but oftentimes a lot of our purchasers do fit that criteria pretty easily. So we've kind of gone through this pretty quick. Typically in this type of presentation, there's a lot of questions. And so it takes a lot of time to kind of, work through those, make sure they're all answered. Does it appear we have any unanswered questions or anything we should go in a bit more depth?
Thank you, Kurt. I don't see any questions. Mark, did you have any? You were going to share those short memos?
I sent one to Kristen to share out, which was an example of a short memo the Treasure Valley class group put together. And then some schools use purchase orders in order to document these types of questions and situations. And as I said, I was thinking it might be a good idea to just kind of combine this into one quick procurement checklist. And I'm typing it as we speak here, just pulling a couple of different ones together, and I'll make sure that gets sent out to all the participants as a kind of a minimum little checklist that you could use. You could put on top of any procurement award that's between $10,000 and $250,000. That'll help you stay in compliance with this requirement. It's always a good idea to have that, and it's interesting because we've had some situations. For example, one of the participants on the call, Anthony, for example, had identified some equipment that he wanted, and it was definitely an award that would fit under these amounts. And it didn't take much of long of an internet search to find several other possible vendors for that product. And once you've done that, then usually it's fairly quick to collect the evidence and the information. And it does not always mean that you have to start a formal process with a vendor. So for example, if you're buying something that's a very standard part ID that you can get from 10 different vendors on the internet, if you can document the search that you did and the vendors you identified, and then just a quick answer of how did you come to the decision of one vendor versus another. Those decisions can be, you can set those parameters. So for example, in some of the procurement situations that Bloom has been, we've had some very competent bidders that were very similar. And so some of the criteria that were used were not only price, but ability to deliver by a certain due date, and the quality, the availability of post acquisition support or warranties, for example. So that you could put a lot of different things into your criteria to make sure that you select the best vendor for you and for what your needs are. And sometimes time of delivery is more important than price, for example, or having local ability to provide quick local support versus not being able to. So there's all these criteria can be built into your procurement checklist for those larger procurements where you're under 250,000, but you're definitely over 10,000.
Correct. And I think that's the important thing, is that you set that criteria up based on the needs of your school. I know from an auditing perspective, we do not question what the criteria is or why you made, if you did a 1 to 10 of, delivery, or, how quick a vendor could deliver, we would never question that. The only thing we could ever question is, hey, you didn't put down any reasoning on why you selected one vendor versus another. So we might say, you had your bids, but there's no indication why you picked one versus another, and it clearly looks like you picked the most expensive one. That might be a question that would come from an auditor. But if you had defined your criteria ahead of time, the auditor is not going to come, or should not come, and ask you, boy, why did you define your criteria this way? And why did you assess that, this vendor has an 8 out of a 10 on delivery time and a, 2 out of a 10 on price, or something like that. Typically, an auditor is not going to question you on those. He's just going to question you, or she's only going to question you on the fact that you didn't document it at all. So yeah, I think setting that up and setting it based on the needs, and that's kind of nice because everybody's a little bit different on that. Some people and some schools insist on delivery. That's a more important thing. Some are extremely price sensitive because they're just in a very difficult financial position and they need to at that point in time. And price is important to everyone, but sometimes depending on what type of service it is, sometimes timeliness can be as important, if not more. So those make a lot of sense to set up that way.
We have a question from Anthony. He said, just to clarify, we only need these rationales on the small bid and sealed bids, correct? We wouldn't need this on something under the micro purchase category.
That is absolutely correct, yes.
Thank you for that question, Anthony. Thank you for the answer, gentlemen. Going to remind everybody that the recording will be posted on our website, and it's going to take a little bit for that to get posted, so it won't be immediate. Heather has a question. How long do you need to maintain these documents? Great question.
From an auditing perspective, a minimum of 5 years, and I should say 5 years. Have you run into anything different on your perspective, Mark?
No, sir. The only difference from a federal tax perspective is that anything that has to do with property acquisition, if you were doing, and you won't be doing that with our federal award, but you may have property acquisition documentation that you're keeping track of. We tend to call those quote unquote permanent records, and that I would usually not dispose of any records having to do with property acquisition or financing. That's the only one that I'm just reluctant to ever get rid of any of that. But other than that, no, your guidelines are fine. 5 years for procurement.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you for mentioning that relating to property. The only other oddball one you might run into there, so 5 years is a general rule. As Mark said, anything relating to property is permanent as long as you have the property. And then also payroll. Payroll uses the same 5-year rule, except for records that relate to dismissing employees. For some reason, they stretched that out to 7 years. I've never seen that be an issue, but the attorneys generally recommend 7 years on that. And again, that doesn't necessarily directly impact federal awards, but it is a payroll rule that they, I guess if you charge that employee's time to a federal program or something like that.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. Last chance attendees, if you have anything you'd like to ask, please type it in the chat box. We'll wait a couple minutes. And I'm just going to, Kurt, I'm going to share my screen and I'm just going to show everyone. Oh, I can't start while you're sharing.
I'm going up to stop right now.
Okay, I'm going to share where Kristen will be posting that for you guys so you can see. There's also other good stuff. Who's buying dinner? Great question. Let me open this up really quick. So you guys are familiar with the website. And I think now I can't see where she said it was, but I believe it's here.
It's under technical assistance for schools.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Kristen.
And then it will be, currently it's labeled grant technical assistance workshops and webinars. So it'll be right there.
All right, thank you.
Second bullet point.
Awesome. Anthony, I thought you were buying dinner. No answer. Crickets chirping. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending, showing up. Food is not allowed under CSP funds, exactly. Water or food. And I just want to, give a great thank you to Kurt for joining us on our first all virtual webinar. And thank you all for attending. And I don't see any more questions. Mark, was there anything else you wanted to say as a follow-up?
Nope. Thank you for attending. I'll send you a little Excel file with a procurement checklist. And again, any questions or surrounding this issue, feel free to contact us. You can also certainly contact your attorneys who help if they're helping you set up your internal policies and procedures. Again, thank you for joining us on a Monday night, and I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks,
Good night.
everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.